Yat bine dinen işle debetli dinen işle aşين başışçin karşı daşıçı dözleşçini daşınela teçici de naşa şey Madison Fulton inişye. Good morning, everybody. My name is Madison Fulton. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I grew up in a small community called Rough Rock on the Navajo Nation. And before we begin our presentation, Eric and I, we always like to acknowledge whose lands we are on. And thank you to the Pueblo people for inviting us out, and you have really beautiful landscape. This is the first time I've been here, so it's really been an amazing experience. But I work at the Intertribal Council of Arizona in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm a health promotion specialist on the Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country project. I did my schooling at the Arizona State University. I studied American Indian Studies, Indigenous rights, and social justice. I graduated with my master's in 2015, and my research topic was sexual assault against American Indian women. Later, I expanded my scope to include children, elders, men, and on tribal lands. So I looked at a lot of the laws and policies that govern criminal jurisdiction on tribal lands. And what I was hoping to accomplish with my area of focus was to develop care systems that are more culturally appropriate for sexual assault victims, that encourages their healing. But that's a little about me.
Okay, this is kind of weird with this mic thing. Anyway, before I begin, I usually like to acknowledge the lands that we are on, just like Madison did, so Pawanke. Thank you for inviting us out here. It's always good to see Pueblo people, and it's really trippy to see so many Indians in one room. So, the ne nishle tulichi ni nishle loge bushes chin touch ni to che topa chanela na ka betwe is in the shash Eric Hardy in the. For those that are not Navajo, my name is Eric Hardy. I originally come from a place called Mexican Springs, New Mexico. And just quickly, just a little bit about myself. I am also a perpetual graduate student. So I'm getting a master's degree in American Indian Studies at the Arizona State University with a focus on language and culture. I've been doing a lot of work around community organizing in the Phoenix area, from a lot of different issues, from mascot issue to land rights, but also we did some work around language revitalization in the Phoenix area, where I helped a group of people to do like a 6-month language immersion session for a lot of the students at ASU and the community in Phoenix, Arizona. So I've done a lot of stuff around this work. And I also work for the Intertribal Council of Arizona. I've been there for about 5 years, and I am currently one of the health promotion specialists. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Madison.
So how many of you know where the Intertribal Council of Arizona is? Or have you been there, know of it? Oh, man. How many even know where the Herd Museum is in Phoenix? The Intertribal Council is right across the street from the Herd Museum. You walk right across the stoplight, and it's right there. But don't feel bad. Like we always ask that question, and about maybe a handful of people will say they know where ITCA is. So.
Are you gonna follow this?
Yeah. So our overview of today's presentation is just to go over ITCA, our grant overview. The interesting thing about Eric and I, we are in the Health and Human Services Department, and we are funded by a public health grant. So just kind of keep that in mind. We do have some activities that we want to walk through with you guys. Eric and I, like I said, our education is in American Indian Studies, and so I've known Eric, God, for like 7 years. Just can't get rid of him. But we went to school together, and during our classes, during our years of schooling, we talked a lot about colonization, settler colonialism, and decolonization. And for Eric and I, we do recognize that given our academic background, it is a privilege to have that many years to talk about those sort of topics. And we're also going to talk about how we introduce cultural resilience within our grant work and within the department that we work for at ITCA, and how we'll also apply that framework with the tribes that we work for. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll all be to identify a strategy for framing grants for cultural resilience work. Build a relatable and practical cultural resilience framework with community members, not grant writers, not other professionals, not our state and federal agencies that we get the funding from, but with community members. And to define a project that creates opportunity for language and culture revitalization. Because again, Eric and I, we work in public health, and which is not really typically an area where, culture and language is incorporated into, but.
Just really quickly too, when we talk about cultural resilience, language work is kind of automatically in that conversation, but we also have to kind of have a conversation with our community members about even what cultural resilience is and the importance of language work within that framework. So this is part of what we do with the tribes that we work with, our tribal partners.
The Intertribal Council of Arizona was established in 1952, and how it got founded was there was a group of individuals who came together during the Termination era. How many of you are familiar with the Termination era? Perfect.
All right, awesome.
That makes me happy. We usually ask that, and maybe like 1 or 2 hands that go up in the air, but most of the time they're grad students or non-natives. So. But for those of you that do not know what the Termination era is, it was a time in the 1950s where the federal government wanted to eliminate the federal recognition status of American Indian tribes. And the reason that that it's so significant to point out is if termination had happened and it has happened to some tribes, there was no tribal enrollment, but more importantly, there's no land base for those community members, and it opens their land bases up to settlement from non-natives, and it also eliminates tribal sovereignty. And as Indian nations, we all have tribal sovereignty and cultural sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty, though, we have a political relationship with the federal government, and that's how we're able to get certain things. Like our own government structures, our own police departments, our own education systems. So for those tribes that were terminated, it was very devastating for them. But for Arizona, a group of individuals came together to stop that from happening in Arizona. So those are some of the foundational roots of the ITCA. And ITCA was also one of the first organizations to actually become an intertribal organization. So we were kind of the first model for that movement, and there's others like Intertribal Council of Nevada, Intertribal Council of Utah, and so that's kind of what we do. We do serve 21 out of 22 tribes in Arizona. They're part of our member board. The only tribe that's not on our member board is the Navajo Nation, but we still do partner with the Navajo Nation on several projects. And this is our team that we work for we work with at ITCA. And you'll notice that we work with non-natives. We work with white people on the grant. And I'm pretty sure all of you within your different programs, you do have to work with non-natives. And also the important thing to highlight is Eric and I, and we have one more cohort member, Emery Tahi. Besides the fact that we're all Navajo, we all went to the American Indian Studies program at Arizona State University. And that's really important to highlight because most of the other individuals that you see up there are from a public health background. We have a couple of epidemiologists on there. And so when you think about that, you have people coming from our background, who's American Indian Studies, advocating for indigenous rights and tribal sovereignty. And then you have other individuals who are from public health and epidemiology, who are very scientific method, scientific approaches, evidence-based approaches. You can kind of see where there might be a clash. And fortunately, for Eric and I, we work with a team that's very willing to have those awkward conversations. We did have a director, a Health and Human Services director. Her name is Gwenda Gorman, and she was very, very supportive in what Eric and I were trying to do with our American Indian Studies degree. So Eric and I, we work on the Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country project. And this project focuses on chronic disease prevention work within tribal communities. And it's a national grant. There's other tribal epidemiology centers that have been awarded this grant. And ITCA is one of them. So this grant is a 5-year grant from the Center of Disease Control and Prevention. It started in 2014, and we're going to be coming to our last year in September 2019. And this grant, like I said, aims to prevent chronic diseases using community-chosen and culturally adapted policies, systems, and environmental changes. So just keep those 2 words in mind, community-chosen and culturally adapted. Those are 2 very important key words. And this grant, since it focuses on chronic disease prevention, the CDC already kind of put some of their measures in there, and those ones were the 7 prevention areas, and I'll get to that later. So what Eric and I do is we provide training and technical assistance, and that can be for a variety of things. It can be for writing policy, implementing policy. We even got called out to help one of our tribes put together community garden boxes and shovel dirt in there. Public presentation. So Eric and I, we kind of have a mixed bag of different things that we do for our tribes. These are the 7 prevention areas. I won't go through all of them, but if you do come to our breakout session, we do have some handouts that we can give you. But the idea behind these 7 prevention areas, again, this is a chronic disease prevention grant. So the idea behind these prevention areas is if you focus, let's say, on number 1, which is reduce the usage of commercial tobacco and decrease exposure to secondhand tobacco smoke, the idea is that if you work on that in your community, you'll be able to decrease the incidence rates of lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, heart disease. So that's the idea, is that if you focus on one of these and you implement it, it's supposed to show a decrease in illness and diseases in the community. Originally, we worked for 13 tribes. Now we work for 11 tribes. We have 8 tribes in Arizona that we work for, 2 in Nevada, and 1 in Utah. And so Eric and I, we travel a lot. And how we're able to work with this many tribes is because of the Tribal Epidemiology Center. It serves the Phoenix area IHS service area. And so that's how we're able to travel to Utah and Nevada. And again, thinking about community chosen and culturally adapted, those are going to look very different for each of those communities. And so that's why we like to highlight that is, and also to keep in mind, Eric and I, we're both Navajo. We're visitors to the tribes that we work for. So when we do our site visits, we always kind of keep that in the back of our mind, that we are just visitors there, and we can't push our ideals, our Diné ideals of community chosen and culturally adapted onto these different communities we work for. So that picture you see in the far corner, those are all our site coordinators that we work for on the GWIC grant. And you'll notice that there are some non-natives who are the site coordinators are the main contacts for each of the tribes that we work for. And each of the tribes, they're supposed to gather and create a coalition. So each of these coalitions, they're the ones actually doing the policy system and environmental changes in these different communities. Eric and I, we're not doing those. We just do what we can to give our site coordinators and the coalitions the tools and the resources that they need to do those community changes. But those are our site coordinators. And like I said, like I pointed out before, you'll notice that some of them are non-natives, and then some of them are non-tribal members working in tribes that they are not from. So keep that in mind, because again, it's really important when we start talking about community chosen and culturally adapted. And you've probably seen some of these in your own communities. And then down here we have a grand opening of a community garden. You'll see that there's the youth. And over here on this far big picture is a picture from San Carlos Apache tribe. The lady there in the blue, her name is Twyla Casador. And what she's doing there with our group and the Center of Disease Control officials is she's showing us the places where food grows within their community. And she's picking and showing us like how to pick them, what time of the year to pick them, and even how to prepare them later. But it's really important to highlight this, because that picture with the bigger group, that is from that department that hosted us is from the Culture Resources Department in the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. This one down here with the children is from the Community Health Representative Department. And Twyla, the department she works in, is the Forest Department service. So these are not all, excluding Salt River, these are departments that are not cultural language departments or cultural resource departments, but they are using a culture resilient framework.
The other thing that we want to highlight here is that we've been talking about language and culture in our communities, right? So when we started our grant, which was about 4 years ago, we came in with the conversation that language and culture should be a part of healing in public health, right? Chronic disease prevention should have a cultural language component. So when we started working with our first site coordinators at that very beginning of our project, we asked them some questions about language and culture. So, and at that time we were working with 12 tribes, and I'm putting this out there so you guys can understand where we were coming from when we started working with this project, is that about the majority of them actually told us that language and culture wasn't something that was important to them. We literally, you guys heard some other stories the past few days, is that language and culture doesn't exist here. That mainstream society is what we are. We don't have language and culture. And again, these are individuals that are working in public health. They are on the ground doing chronic disease prevention work. They're in homes trying to get folks to do insulin shots. They're at these places. And for a lot of them, language and culture wasn't something that was in their mind when it came to healing. So this is something that we had to work with our tribes, and that's what we're here to show you guys, is how can we empower language and culture in the space of public health where our site coordinators don't see it as a priority. And I'm kind of certain that there's a lot of that in the room here, right? You guys have language and culture, but you can't figure out how to get people involved in this conversation of language revitalization. So again, this is important to highlight. And with Twyla, we have to remember that with Twyla, she is very culturally and language grounded, but she's also in a fire and forestry department. she doesn't get a lot of support from language and culture in San Carlos. So there's a disconnect in our communities when it comes to language and culture and working together with other departments. This is what we call siloing, right? We like to silo things, especially within our grants. Grants kind of say X, Y, Z, and we can have to only work within this box. So we had to kind of come in and kind of take some of this apart. So hopefully we can kind of show you how we did some of that in the next coming slides.
So for Eric and I, again, we went to AIS and we could talk till we're blue in the face about decolonization, but for our community members and our site coordinators, not so much. Because our site coordinators, this is the Good Health and Wellness Grant. It's not the only grant that they oversee. They have multiple grants that they're trying to manage. So we couldn't have a year-long conversation about decolonization. And again, this grant is only 5 years, so we couldn't spend a great amount of time talking about decolonization. But we did talk about it because it is important to chronic disease prevention work, but also to incorporating culture and language into chronic disease work.
So how many of you guys are familiar with the term decolonization? Right? Okay.
Oh, okay.
So that's great. When we introduced the idea of cultural resilience in the framework of decolonization, a lot of our site coordinators didn't understand how that worked. So we had to kind of come into this conversation with them and ask them other questions for us about what are we talking about when we talk about decolonization, because that's important to talk about. We use the word, but sometimes we forget how to define it and then help define it in a way that our tribal members can understand it. So these are some of the questions that we asked to help define this word. We came up with the definition is that decolonization is really simply the healing of ourselves and our communities and families from the impacts of colonialism. Okay, so we talk about impacts of colonialism. It's a little bit different than when we just say like colonization. But we had to kind of take that conversation and ask another question. If we're talking about healing, what are we healing from, right? If decolonization is here and it's about healing, we also have to talk about what are we healing from? And how are we healing is important, because we could just heal using Western methods, or we could heal in other ways, right? And then how do we begin to heal in a way that it makes sense to us? These are questions that we asked ourselves at ITCA, and then we asked ourselves, how can we ask these questions in a way that makes sense to our site coordinators? Again, you gotta remember our site coordinators weren't on this conversation that we were having. And the last thing is, and you guys have been mentioning this in different ways throughout this conference, is how do we know when we are actually healed, right? That's something that we should start asking questions about. If we're talking about language and culture being lost and that's hurting us, how do we know when we're actually healed? So these are some of the things that we were thinking about when we started this grant, and we'll talk a little bit about how we did the grant to mirror some of this, but also how we had conversations with our tribes to help them understand it, so that the work that they do in chronic disease prevention was cultural resilience in the context of decolonization, but using language and culture in that space.
So I came on in year 2 of the grant. Eric has been on the grant since the beginning. And for Eric, in our classes, we have to critically take things apart. And for us, this grant, Eric, took those 2 words, community chosen and culturally adapted, and he highlighted those. And he asked, what does community chosen mean, and what does culturally adapted mean? So Eric was, laying that groundwork to have those conversations. But more importantly, what does good health and wellness mean? It's in the title of the grant. And so when I came on in year 2, Eric and I, we sat down and we kind of took those keywords apart more. And and then also the important thing to highlight here is CDC, the Center of Disease Control, they weren't really defining those terms at all. They couldn't really give us a direction. So with that in mind, we were able to, okay, since you're not going to define it, we are going to define it for our tribes and how we want to structure this grant and the projects that come out of this grant. Because we just didn't want this grant to be, you know, a deliverable sheet that you just check off, like, oh, okay, I went to a webinar, I went to a conference, I, you know, designed a poster. We didn't want it to be that. We wanted this project to be more meaningful. We wanted it to be have more impact, and more importantly, we wanted this project to benefit the tribes that we work for, because often you probably hear it, all these different research grants, all these different surveys, you know, coming through your community, but you never really know what happened to those results. You don't really know what has become of that work. So for us, Eric and I, that's why those key words are really important to us. We wanted it to make a bigger impact than just being another grant that you get supplied for X amount of years.
So you guys could do this with your own grants. You can literally take the grant language and define these terms, because chances are they're not defining it. So when you can define it like we did, again, back to the conversation about decolonization, is that we define cultural, adapted, and community chosen from a decolonization lens. But we needed to kind of do something else too, and we'll walk you guys through what we did next.
So again, Eric and I, in our academics, we took lots of classes about Indigenous research methodologies. And so for us, this was our Indigenous framework approach. The first one up there is accountability, respectfulness. We prioritize relationships. We are responsible to community. These were our basic principles of how we wanted to do the work that we do for the tribes that we work for. But the thing that we noticed, because we started going to a lot of public health conferences, the thing that we started to notice was these key words were being used by almost everybody. But the thing about it is when you sit down and you listen to their research, like for example, I sat in on one, and this person had said all this good stuff, like, you know, we have this framework and it hits on accountability. But this particular individual did not give free, prior, and informed consent on what they were doing with the data. And they presented this data at this national conference. So the question I asked that person was, does the community know you are talking about their data here? Did you get permission to talk about that data here? It was silent. So for Eric and I, at that moment, we were like, okay, we have to take a step back, and we needed to define what each of these things were and how we were going to implement it in the grant.
Again, this is where we were starting to define our lens, right? With the language, the grant language, if we define it from a certain lens, something pops out. So the lens that we use to define is actually where we got our degrees from. American Indian Studies from ASU. And the reason why we chose that lens is because it highlights different things, right? It highlights concepts of sovereignty and indigenousness, highlights desperate worldviews, knowledge systems, languages, highlights colonization and decolonization. It highlights some privileges, oral stories, oral history, and traditional knowledge. That's the lens that we looked at, community chosen, culturally adapted.
And it also highlights tribal sovereignty and indigenousness. And this paradigm was written by our professor, Dr. James Ridingen, from the Pawnee Nation. And then, so you see the American Indian Studies paradigm, but then you switch it to public health. This is the public health paradigm from the World Health Organization. And in here, it has no mention of tribal sovereignty, indigenousness. It doesn't address colonization or decolonization. So more or less, public health is about health equity. equal access to health. But as we all kind of know in Indian country, the Indian Health Service is our, primary healthcare provider. And that big area map that we showed you before, let's say Utah needed surgery. One of the tribes in Utah needed a surgery. They would have to travel all the way to Phoenix to get that surgery. So when we talk about equal access to health, that's not really equal access to health. And we do have our tribal clinics, and they do their best to provide what they can, but again, they are limited in their workforce and what they can provide at that time to their community members. So you can kind of see, again, where these two worldviews kind of clash with each other.
So public health is a lens again, right? It's a different lens. And that lens leaves out sovereignty, indigenousness. So when we come back to that framework, right, and we have an AIS lens on it, something else pops out now.
So again, earlier I said that Eric and I, we had to take the time to step back and define what those key terms mean. So now with accountability, it's accountability to each nation and recognizing their tribal sovereignty status. And we do this with an MOA between ITCA and each tribes that we work for. And one of the key things in this MOA is the protection of data sovereignty rights. Eric and I, we're not going to go out and publish and get rich off of the information that our tribes have. And in there it says that the data rights, they belong to the tribe. We're not going to use that information without their say-so. Other things too, like respectfulness. Again, Eric and I, we're just visitors. We're Navajo visitors when we go to our tribe. So when we go visit our tribes, we can't tell them how to do things in their community. We can't say like, oh, if you use culture and language in this certain way, it's going to work. We have to be very mindful that each community is different. They have their own needs, their own political structure, their own issues and concerns that they have. Prioritizing relationships. Eric and I, and it kind of just in Indian country in general, relationships are really, really important. Because some people, some community members, they'll just, call you out and ask you, what are you doing here? Who do you work for? And we've had to take that in stride. We can't get offended. We just have to tell them why we're there. And, we have to build that repertoire with them. And eventually we get a relationship there. And we have to respect that relationship because there was time and effort that went into developing that relationship. Responsibility to community. Again, Eric and I, we wanted this grant to, make a positive impact. We wanted it to be, we wanted it to benefit the community members. So that's how we framed our approach.
So again, just to recap, this is us, ITCA, myself and Madison, with degrees that understand lenses, that understand paradigms, that understand this academic knowledge, applying it to a grant, right? That's what we know how to do. We've been to school to do that. But that's us looking at the grant to create the project. The next step was to how can we do this where our tribes, the tribal partners, our community members can understand it? Because that's the important part, is how do we do this work? As much as we have our degrees and everything in our back pockets, how do we get our tribes to understand what this means to them? So we had to kind of find a way to do that. And we did this kind of with examples, with activities to help get them kind of on the same page, but also to inform us of what community chosen and culturally adapted look like from their perspectives. So it was a back and forth. So that's kind of what we started to do now. So we're moving from defining the grant back to like how do we do cultural resilience, i.e. language and culture revitalization with the communities that we're working with using a public health grant. So
again, Eric and I, we had to juggle, public health and AIS. So we looked at it, we looked at these two approaches, and we looked at health from these two approaches. So these were some of the questions that we had asked our tribes from the get-go. And please, write down some examples for yourself, and then if you come to our breakout session, we can talk about some of those things. So the first question is, what does health or being healthy mean to you? So write down a couple of examples. And now, think about and write, where do you get your ideas and information of health or being healthy from? So one is asking what health and healthy means to you, and asking is, where do you get these ideas from? So we asked our tribes these questions, and a couple of the answers they gave us, because again, these are people who work in community health, or they work in the health and education department, or they work in intervention and prevention programs, they work in the schools. These were some of the answers they said. They were like, oh, okay, no diabetes, no hypertension, no high blood pressure, no cirrhosis, and no cancer. That's what they thought health was. But essentially what they were talking about was the public health perspective, is the elimination of illness and diseases. That's what they were telling us. We're like, okay. And then they got that. Oh, next question. So when we asked them, where did you get that information from? And they told us, oh, we got it from the doctors, our programs, our funders. We got it from scientists, schools, professors, nurses. We're like, oh, okay. So that's where they're getting this information from about being healthy. And we're like, oh, okay.
So again, you can see how they're defining it, right? It's very Western.
It's, very Western idea of health. So we asked a different set of questions. We asked them, how is health defined from a cultural perspective? So write down a few ideas about health from a cultural perspective. And again, where and who do you get your health or your cultural teachings and knowledge about health from? So just write down a couple of your answers and we'll talk about it later. We got a whole different set of answers. People were telling us health to them was health of indigenous knowledge, practicing ceremony, knowing oral history, speaking and learning the language, and indigenous food knowledge. That was a big one, because when we talk about chronic diseases, that was a big one. It was like location of traditional foods, the names of those foods, how to pick those foods, how to prepare those foods, how do you eat those foods. And the common thing out of all these different 12, 13 tribes was that the health of the land was important to them. If the land is healthy, we are healthy. And so there's this connection back to the land that was just kind of a commonality between all of them. And when we asked them, where and who do you get your ideas about healthy from? They said the elders, medicine people. We get it from ceremony. We get it from our stories. We get it from our songs. We get it from our medicinal people, our herbalists. We get it from family, community, and even our own individual experiences with culture and language. So these are a couple of the individuals. That mountain is the Do'oslid over in Flagstaff. But that, that mountain is sacred to 13 other tribes in Arizona. Then we have Winona no Nuke Leduc. And then we have a Navajo elder. She's standing up for her rights against coal mining.
So again, we did this activity to help our community members understand an American Indian perspective on health and a Western perspective on health. And then that's the two lenses, right? Like I was talking earlier. So this is how we did that. So now they're aware of the two lenses of how they can do health in their community. Just like what Dr. Wallen was talking about earlier, where he was talking about very academically, which is great, but we wanted to kind of bring that down to the community members. So we had to ask another question because we're aware of that, right? We know like culture is here and Western's here, but then there's also where we're at now. So I'll let Madison go with that.
So we asked them currently, what does health look like in your community? So again, write down some answers about what does health look like in your community. And the next question was, do you think we live in a healthy way from our cultural teachings? If yes, why? If no, why not? So just jot down a couple of your answers. And I think that was the last set of questions. I think that one was more of the hard discussion to have, but it was also a really important discussion. And the reason being that it was a hard discussion was a lot of our tribes are like, okay, we have high rates of violence in our community. We have high rates of diabetes, and our people are dying at a younger age. And we were like, okay, you know, and because I'm pretty sure we all know somebody in our family who's been impacted by chronic diseases. Those are really hard conversations to have because it doesn't feel good to talk about those kinds of things. And we're like, you know, why do you think that is? And they're like, oh, well, you know, cultural losses. We don't have a lot of culture. And we are not fluent speakers. We don't speak our language. And again, this is important because when we asked the second question about where do you get your health from your cultural teachings from, our culture and our language very much grounds and centers how we take care of ourselves as healthy people. So that's why that's really important. And others was, you know, community is disorganized. We have tribal council doing this. This department doesn't want to work with this department. We also had a high staff turnover in our departments. Grant funding has ended. So I'm pretty sure some of these things are kind of, you know, you can relate to. But that's what some of our tribes were telling us. Even some things as tribal enrollment. That, you know, people, they're disenrolling or they're redefining the enrollment status. So these are really tough conversations to have. But again, Eric and I and ITCA, we felt like these conversations were important. And we asked them, why do you think the community is the way that it is? And they're like, well, culture is suppressed. We're not allowed to bring culture and language into a public health grant, a road development grant, a justice grant. And they didn't see that their culture wasn't or isn't relevant. And when we were asking this question about chronic disease prevention, like in our first example, they did not mention anything. They were about diabetes and cirrhosis and all these things, very much from that closed box.
And again, you gotta remember that when we first started the grant, they were like, language and culture just isn't on the board. It wasn't something that was important. But they knew about the losses, right? Mm-hmm. They knew something happened, but they didn't understand how to make those connections. So again, we started to have them understanding the Indigenous approach and then the Western approach, and now we're where we're at. We all know that language and culture is important, but how do we get there, especially when we're dealing with this? So that's the same thing we did with our tribes. It was like, well, you guys are talking about it, but you guys aren't naming it, which is part of this conversation. So you guys are familiar with Tom Tortellino? I always say tortellino like the pasta, but right? That's a pretty clear example of that. Colonization and historical trauma are what's causing us to kind of not want to do the language and culture stuff. But sometimes our community members, the tribes that we work with, didn't understand how all of this worked. These words, colonization, were kind of way out there. Historical trauma is kind of way out there. It's not a way for them to understand what it is. So what we had to do with our grant, again, back to the beginning of our grant, when we talked about our community members not knowing about how language and culture fits in, we kind of had to understand what this is to empower them to make a change. And what we did next with our tribes was help them understand what all of these terms are in a way that they could understand it, and then empower themselves. So we talk about colonization, but sometimes we don't talk about the impacts of colonization, which is a little bit different. Just so you guys know, everyone in this room is impacted by colonialism. You may not feel like you're colonized, which is fine, but you definitely feel the impacts of colonization in yourself, your family, your community, and your nations. So that's what we're healing from, right? And we did this in the context of colonization is two things. It's a process that creates a relationship, okay? Keep those things in mind. And this is how we taught our community members about what colonization is. We didn't want to make it something so abstract. The process is here, right? Denial withdrawal is kind of when they first came and we're like, you guys aren't even humans. You guys are children, actually. You guys don't know what you're doing. Next came destruction, eradication, literally destruction of our homes, our people.
Our food.
Our foods, our kinship ties. Denigration, belittlement, insult. That's the schools, that's the government, right? Government says we don't have our traditional governments. We don't have an educational system because we don't have knowledge. So you can see how these things work. It's a process, okay? We're giving surface accommodation, right? You can see this in Sedona, where they have Navajo Plaza or Hojoa Plaza or wherever. Apache helicopter, Cherokee car. Whatever remains is a surface accommodation. Like, you guys have a language program. That's really nice, right? Transformation, exploitation. What that means is then that whatever remains after 500 years of colonization is now transformed and exploited. We see this everywhere with dream catchers, your Navajo designs, your Pueblo designs.
Or those New Agers.
New Agers taking our stuff again, you know? But the other part of this transformation exploitation is actually elimination, all right? This is something that most people don't talk about. There's colonization, which is them coming here, doing what they need to do, then they're usually supposed to go home. That's what colonization is. We live in settler colonialism, which is they're here to stay. And when they stay, they eliminate what was originally here. So transformation exploitation is not transformation, it's actually now eliminated. We can see this in name places, right? So I'll use Dokotzlid as an example. That's one of our sacred mountains in Dene. It's now called San Francisco Peaks. That's elimination. That's not transformation now. That's elimination. English language is doing the same thing, right? We are no longer being assimilated with our schools. We are now being eliminated in our schools. That's the way this works now. We are beyond the assimilation phase. We are currently in the elimination phase. So that's how we talked about colonization with our tribes, is that it's a process. It started 500 years and it continues.
And that's the thing we wanted to tell our tribes is colonization, we like to think of it as a historical event that happened a long time ago, but it's actually still continuing today.
So again, colonization is a process. In order for colonization to take place, one people, those guys over there, have to engage another people. And that engagement, it can be nonviolent or violent. So there's usually creates this, the colonizer and the colonized. That's the relationship, right? Two people. And that relationship has been created over 500 years. And that relationship is usually based on violence and nonviolence, usually on war, right? Assimilation, we just talked about that. Then we were all put on reservations. That's the relationship we have now with the colonizer, i.e. non-natives. Our relationship in terms of sovereignty is that we have quasi-sovereignty, right? We have our treaties, that's the relationship. So colonization is a process that creates this relationship and creates the colonizer and the colonized, and you cannot have one without the other. You cannot be in colonization if you don't have a colonizer. So this is how we talked about it with our tribes, and in this case, it started to make sense to them, like, the stuff that we are going through in our communities isn't our fault. It's actually because of this relationship, right? So back to this conversation about settler colonialism. In settler colonialism, there's the relationship, but literally it's all about them, and everything else gets erased. Even our history gets erased and eliminated. And in order for that to take place, one creates permanence through erasure. And this engagement is, again, violent, nonviolent. And settler colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. What that means is that this building is a structure, it creates permanence here. Albuquerque is a structure. And in that building of the structure, it's erasing the indigenous presence in that area. You can see it on the signs. It's all in English. There's no Pueblo words. I mean, there's Pueblo words, but it's surface accommodation, right? Back to colonization and erasure. This is what settler colonialism, this is what we live in now. And when we did this for our tribes, things started to make sense. So we talked about colonization now, a relationship, right? Now, we also had to kind of talk a little bit about what are those impacts of colonialism. And in this case, we start talking about historical trauma. Everyone's been talking about it, all things, but we're couching, again, we're putting historical trauma in context of colonialism, okay? And you guys know the term up there, cumulative, emotional, psychological wound over lifespan creates current trauma responses to collective past. And this is how we explain it to our tribes, through cartoons. That trauma that he's feeling right there, he's getting punched in the face. That's the trauma that literally we've been punched in the face for 500 years. That's the colonizer and colonized. The trauma is him getting hit in the face. But we also don't really talk about historical trauma response. We have a choice on how we respond to this trauma. In this case, he's crying, right? That's what you do after you get hit in the face. It hurts, you're crying. That's the response to your trauma. That's a healthy response. But when we look at our historical trauma, we can see that our relationship with the United States was violent, but we were never allowed to respond in a healthy way. In fact, our culture and language and everything that we responded halfway was kind of taken away from us. So understanding how historical trauma works in terms of colonization, the tribes now understood where that trauma comes from in their communities. It wasn't just there, it's actually part of a longer conversation around colonization. So some of the things that they said beginning of their grant, like I don't know where language fits in, they now understood why. They were understanding the madness in our communities. So it wasn't some sort of secret. So we were saying we had 5 minutes.
Yeah.
You want to skip this?
Yeah.
Okay. So
you come to our breakout session, we'll go over these questions with you.
So just really quickly, these are some of the examples of historical trauma, everything from like massacres, reservations, to even current traumas like today, like Standing Rock. Back at home, we have No Loop 202, which is Arizona Department of Transportation is blowing a hole in one of the sacred mountains of the Aat and the Gila River Indian community there. That's there. The missing and murdered Indigenous woman. That's historical trauma. That's, if you're on Facebook, literally every week there is a handful of missing Indigenous women. It's hard to say, but we respond to their trauma like in these ways, right?
So we've seen like examples like, domestic violence in our community, unhealthy eating, hopelessness, depression. And I've heard throughout the conference, feeling ashamed of our American Indian identities. Those are some of the traumatic responses to historical trauma.
So we talked about what are we healing from, right? And now we're going to shift it. Instead of talking about all the bad stuff, which we kind of have to talk about, we talk about now how do we heal? What happens after colonization? As a response, we said, well, there's actually a process of decolonization. So this is how we get out of that. So the first part is rediscovery and recovery. And this is what we just did with our tribes. We understand why our cultural knowledge and things were taken away from us, the history behind all this that we feel in our communities. And then we start to mourn what was lost and taken from us, right? I tell people that I don't speak Navajo very well, but I understand why. Now I can actually mourn what I don't speak. It's part of it, right? We mourn it, we let it go, we kind of say, okay, it's not my fault, it's not my community's fault. We mourn those things. But then we don't want to stay in mourning. We actually want to start dreaming. What is possible now with our language and culture? What does it look like if we didn't have colonization happen? So we start to dream, start to kind of think of what's possible. And in this case, like, what would it look like if we all were at home and everyone spoke our languages, right? So we're breaking out of the mourning process and starting to dream about that. But we don't want to just dream about it. We actually want to make a commitment towards that. And that's what we start to do. We commit to that dream and we start making those changes. And then we eventually start putting it into action. And this is, like I said earlier, we started with our tribes up at the top, and we've been working with them through some of these things with the grant, the Chronic Disease Prevention Grant.
Just real quickly, I wanted to share, one of the tribes that told us that they were mainstream, that they did not have culture and language in their tribe. When we started this process, that was at the beginning, that's what they said to us. And when we started this process with them, now, by the end of it, in the action phase, they're actually doing a cultural calendar for their foods with their names, the places and locations of that food, and they're going to use their cultural cyclical system of gardening. And they recently did a video with the ILI digital storytelling training of Itsy Bitsy Spider in their language. So you can see that big shift, whereas before they said we are mainstream, we don't have culture and language. And now with the Good Health and Wellness Project, they're actually developing activities with culture and language.
So what is decolonization, right? Again, it's a process that breaks the relationship between the colonizers and colonized and recreates it from our own sense of humanity. We're no longer the colonized, we're actually Dene, we're actually Apache, we're actually who we are as people. And it's not based on power or oppression, it's based on respect, dignity, honor. So it gets rid of those things.
And we've had to do that with the CDC. We had to tell them, hey, our perspectives, our Indigenous perspectives of health and wellness, they're just as good, if not better, than public health. And so we've had to have those conversations so that, the CDC and the federal agencies, they see us like, oh, okay, as not like a net imbalance relationship, but now we have an understanding of each other.
So again, when we were talking about decolonization and dreaming part, we emphasize cultural resilience because that's the ability to overcome stress and regain health and well-being after experiencing adversity. But we really like this term by Gerald Visner. He talks about survivance, which is the native people's individual and collective abilities to persist despite the enormous adversity imposed by colonialism. So when we were talking about mourning and then dreaming, we really emphasize cultural resilience with our tribes. And that's what they started to understand, that cultural resilience was our healing, was how we were going to break colonialism and start doing our work in decolonization.
And really just a plain example of that is their mission statements. They said mission and vision statements. We have diabetes now, but let's work towards eliminating diabetes. Their vision statement was, we want healthy Apache people. We want healthy Ute people. So you can see that there's that change towards survivance and cultural resilience.
So we'll go through this on our breakout session.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit how we did this with ITCA, because we're a nonprofit organization, just so you guys know. So when we came back to this with our tribes, they now understood these things a little bit differently after we talked about colonization, decolonization, and resilience. They actually now had a good idea what this meant in terms of actually using language and culture. And this is kind of to give you a real quick framework thing, like visuals. This is all we really did, is we created one framework and put an Indigenous framework, and we created a spectrum.
Using community chosen and culturally adapted.
Right? So it's a spectrum, right? And all we did with ITCA and our tribal partners was just help them move over here. That's all we do.
Because again, we're all impacted by colonization. So where we are at, we might be more comfortable with public health. Other tribes might be more comfortable with traditional knowledge. But again, using community chosen and culturally adapted, Eric and I, we work towards moving our tribes from public health to the Indigenous framework.
So what Madison means is like tribe one, let's put, I don't know, we'll just say we'll just say tribe one. Maybe they're more, again, colonization impacts all of us, and some of us are more impacted by colonization than others. So tribe one may not have the same resources as, say, a tribe that has the language and culture, like tribe two. So where they start on this conversation of cultural resilience and decolonization is going to be different. And we work with 11 tribes, and I can tell you that all of them are in different places on this. And like Madison said earlier, we're Navajo trying to do cultural resilience and decolonization work in a community that we're not from. So we're very aware of this. We meet them where they're at, and we, like the conversation of having those questions, help inform us of where we start our conversation about healing with them. See, where do we begin to heal? And this is kind of what it looks like on the overall whole when it comes to public health, is that diabetes is something that we've never had traditionally. So we do need our insulin shots. But we can also do our cultural stuff, like learning how to eat the healthy foods from our communities and learn the language. That's kind of all we really did. We just helped them frame the conversation and empowered them to do that work. Yeah. And now they see themselves as change agents in their community to do decolonization work and look into cultural resilience and learning language and culture.
So what we essentially just tried to do was, you know, you do, like Eric said, you do need the public health, it's needed, but with the Indigenous lens, we can get back to our cultural roots and identity as what does it mean to be a healthy Indigenous person, a healthy Navajo person, a healthy, you know, Pueblo person, Apache person. And so what we tried to get back to the foundation was what our ancestral teachings have been, have provided for us. That's what we're trying to get back to with all those prevention areas.
So just quickly, some of the projects that we've been working with our tribes now is like indigenous gardening. Instead of just like a community garden with like your healthy foods, they're actually planting their own traditional foods and learning the names of those things and how to prepare them. We even have some tribes going out into the land. It's not a garden, going out into the land and actually foraging the foods that are naturally growing into the area and learning the way in which they talk about it, and even learning about their clans from those original places. So what we really are doing is taking some of those resources on the left there, like the resources like in your gardens, whatnot, and trying to make them more like Twyla here.
And what Twyla was doing in that picture I showed you earlier, she was showing us how to pick those foods. And at the end of the day, the foods that she picked, we made a campfire and she prepared it for us right then and there. She made us a 3-course meal using foods that she had picked throughout our visit with CDC.
And what she was also doing was telling us names and different uses, or just to say the language, the Apache names of these plants, and telling us where they come from and their oral history, the medicinal purposes, but all using language. And that's what she was telling us. And then she just made that food that she was gathering all day right there and made us a meal.
It didn't come from a garden box like you see down there. It came from the land.
So that's all we're doing with our grant. I think we might be out of time.
If you come to our breakout session, Eric and I will talk about our successes and challenges during that time. But thank you. We appreciate the time.
Thank you.